And the state government says it's going to extend the deadline for the remaining residents of Wittenoom to leave, but hasn't announced a new date yet. The last two residents were supposed to leave last week, but are still living in the asbestos-riddled town. A government spokesperson hasn't explained why the original deadline was not met or what the new deadline will be. But since the ABC's been covering Wittenooms' closure this week, we've received a few comments, like this one on Facebook from Rebecca, who says, Witenoom is an absolutely beautiful place, and the fact that the residents are still alive says much for the lethality of asbestos. Rebecca says they'd be far more at risk being in Port Hedland. Melita Markey is the CEO of the Asbestos Diseases Society of Australia. Melita, good morning.
Oh, good morning, Eddie.
Just how dangerous or just how risky is the asbestos at Wittenoom?
Well, look, there's no safe level of asbestos. It really depends on your exposure matrix. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you a little bit about to your listeners is we don't know why some people are more susceptible than others. We're still looking at the science in that, and we have very poor investment in that, disappointingly. But what happens is if you are susceptible, it goes about how often you are exposed. So, for example, if you're a worker and you're working with asbestos, say you're a plumber or a tradie, or you're working very close to the Wittenooms area where it's highly contaminated, you're building up your level of exposure. We can't see the fibres that actually lodge in our lungs. They're very microscopic. They're usually about 5 microns or smaller. So what happens is you build up your exposure every time you're exposed. And if you're more predisposed to it, then you're at risk of developing a disease. So when authorities say to you, oh, well, you've gone to Wittenooms, it's once off, it's a very low risk, they don't know how many times prior to that you've been exposed to fibre. You might have renovated an asbestos house. Your parents might have done it when you were a child. You might work with it. So it's such a general term to say, well, you've only been there once, it's a low risk. Well, we don't know what your history is. So it's nebulous to say that. But Wittenoom there's no town in the world that has been contaminated like Wittenoom with asbestos. It's unique. It is considered in world terms, occupationally, as a very dangerous place to be.
Because we've had, a comment, this one from Darren. He says, well, the Pilbara's littered with asbestos, including Karajini National Park. Chris says half the Pilbara and especially the ports are contaminated. Bet they don't shut them down. What would you say to those who do have this view that it's a more widespread issue, or that maybe, they feel the issue at Wittenoom is not as severe as authorities say?
No, it is. Wittenoom is a dangerous place. And there are areas, so for example, like the Roburn-Wittenoom Road, that's a highly contaminated road because during the time when they used to take the asbestos along that road, many of the bags were dropped along there, contaminating the road. So there's quite a lot of dust, and it would be prudent to actually seal that road. And there's also contamination, yes, at the ports. So again, it really depends on your exposure matrix. So those people saying, well, it's not very dangerous because, but they may not have had an exposure to asbestos, so that might be their first exposure going there. But if you're going there time and time again, you're building up your exposure. And because we don't know who's more predisposed, it really is a lottery. So, for example, we've had people that have worked in the airline industry flown into Wittenoom because the airport didn't close in Wittenoom until November 93. And they never stepped foot off the tarmac into town, but they've died of mesothelioma, and that's their only exposure.
Does it concern you to hear that some people around WA have a little bit of a blasé attitude towards this?
It does, because it dilutes what is a very a terrible legacy that the people of Western Australia have been left to deal with. I was just listening to the radio about Toyota having to pay compensation for those dodgy filters for all those vehicles. It was a product liability issue. Now, I don't see why people are being left to deal with legacy asbestos to clean it up, or the councils. It should be a product liability issue. I don't see why West Australian people being still 60 years later still dealing with the closure of Wittenooms. It's ridiculous. You know, there's been government reports, which people can go on our website and have a look, the report of the Select Committee appointed to inquire into Wittenooms. There's so much scientific evidence in that, into about how contaminated the area is. You know, there was such a look into it because of wanting to develop the tourism in the area. And for that to happen, a lot of remediation work was needed to be done back in the day, and it still hasn't been dealt with. It's just been left. Now, mining companies are wanting to expand into the area. So, for example, Mulga Downs, which is not far from Wittenoom, as you know, has put into the EPA about getting mining established there, iron ore mining. So, again, we're still dealing with the air quality issues there, and we still are not looking at that in a way that is up to date.
So there are a number of issues still unresolved. The last couple of residents remaining in the town, rehabilitating the area. What do the priorities need to be for the government from here?
Well, for a start, the Asbestos Disease Society would like to be on the steering committee for Wittenoom to be involved in the cleaning up. That would be a first really important step. And secondly, we need to have a look at it. Wittenoom is Australia's worst industrial disaster. It's second in the world. It's still one of the most contaminated sites in the world. And we're still not, it's the elephant in the Pilbara. You know, we need to actually sit down and be realistic about it. And I do believe we can solve the situation and at least remediate the site so it reduces some of the risk to workers in the area and to industry in the area. There's no issue with continuing with mining, but let's just deal with the situation and look at how we measure air quality, look at how we remediate the site. There's a lot of solutions out there. And as I said recently, I would like to see an international competition. If the state government and the mining companies can't come up with a solution for remediation, let's put it out to the world. Let's have a competition and get the best engineers in the world to come there and look at remediating the site. I'm very sure that a solution can be found. It's just a matter of will.
Melita Markey, I appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Melita Markey, the CEO of the Asbestos Diseases Society of Australia.